The bread was still warm when she tore it. She did not look up. She did not check who might be watching from the gilded length of the ballroom, did not measure the distance between her crouch on the marble and the tall doors where the music spilled out in waves of violin and laughter. She had perhaps a minute, maybe less, before someone noticed a kitchen girl on her knees beside the wrong kind of person, and she had already decided that a minute was enough. "Eat slowly," she said. "If you eat it fast, you will be sick, and they will say it was the bread and not the cold." The old man on the floor did not answer. He had been propped against the base of a marble column like a forgotten parcel, his coat the color of wet ash, his hands folded in his lap with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was a kind of safety. 100 guests had passed him on their way into the ballroom. She had counted, because she counted everything. It steadied her. 42 had stepped over his outstretched leg without altering their stride. 11 had glanced at him and then sharpened their glance into nothing. 3 had laughed. None had stopped. She had stopped. She had not meant to. She had been carrying a tray of empty glasses back to the scullery when she had seen the leg, the boot worn through at the toe, and a part of her that she had not yet learned to govern had simply set the tray down on the windowsill and turned back. Now she tore the bread again, smaller this time, and pressed the piece into his hand. His fingers closed on it with surprising precision, not the fumbling grip of a man undone by hunger, something more measured. She noticed it the way she noticed everything. She filed it away without comment. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rougher than she had expected, and quieter, and entirely without the thickened consonants of someone who had been drinking to stay warm. She had heard those voices before, in the alley behind the kitchens, and his was not one of them. "There is broth in the pot by the back stair," she said. "I will bring some. Stay here. I am not likely to wander." She almost smiled. Almost. It was the dryness that did it, the small inflection at the end of the sentence that belonged to a man who had once been amused by his own circumstances, and had not, even now, entirely surrendered the habit. She filed that away, too. "Eat," she said again, and stood, smoothing her apron with hands that she would not allow to shake. The corridor behind her was the kind of corridor that money built when it wished to forget that money had been built. Long, lacquered, lined with portraits of men who had been important enough to be painted and unimportant enough to be forgotten. She walked it quickly. At the far end, where the kitchens opened into a yellow square of lamplight and steam, the head footman was standing with his arms crossed, and he had been watching her. "Yelena?" "Sir." "What were you doing on the floor?" "Picking up a glass, sir." "There was no glass." "There was, sir. I disposed of it." He looked at her for a long moment. She kept her eyes on the second button of his waistcoat, which was the kind of thing they taught girls like her to do, and she counted his breaths. 3, 4. On the 5th, he made a small, dismissive sound in his throat and turned away, and she went past him into the kitchen with the careful unhurriedness of someone whose hurry would be punished. The broth was thin tonight, because tonight was not a night the broth was meant to be seen. Tonight the kitchens were producing trays of pheasant glazed the color of old amber, and tiny pastries shaped like crowns, and a soup the color of nothing she had ever seen the sky be. And every steward in the house had been told that the broth in the back pot was for the staff, and was not to leave the staff corridor under any circumstances. She filled a small earthen cup. She covered the cup with a square of linen. She tucked the cup against her ribs, beneath the fold of her shawl, and she walked back down the long corridor, with her face composed in the precise expression of a girl who had been sent to fetch something dull. The old man was where she had left him. The bread was gone. He had folded the crumbs into the linen square she had given him and tied the corners. She noted that, too, and the noting tightened something in her chest she could not yet name. "You did not eat the crusts," she said, kneeling. "I am saving them." "For when?" "For later." He had not yet looked at her directly. He had spoken to the hem of her apron, to the stone 2 inches from her knee, to the air just above her shoulder. Now he raised his head, and she felt the look land before she met it, the way one feels the weight of a hand before the hand touches. His eyes were gray, not the gray of weather, the gray of a struck bell, if a bell could be a color. They were tired. They were not dim. "What is your name?" he said. It was not a question. "Yelena." "Yelena what?" "Yelena Merisova." "Merisova," he repeated, as if tasting the shape of it. "And you are kitchen, or you are floor?" "Both, when they need both." "And tonight they need both." "Tonight they need everything." He nodded once. He drank the broth in slow, measured swallows, holding the cup with both hands the way a child might, though there was nothing childish in the holding. When the cup was empty, he set it down beside him with the same care he had used for the crusts. And he looked at her again, and she had the distinct, disorienting sense of being read the way she read other people, comprehensively, gently, without permission and without malice. "Why did you stop?" he said. She considered her answer. She had been taught by the corridor and the kitchens and the head footman's silences that the truest answers were rarely the safest. She also suspected, on no evidence she could name, that this was not a man for whom the safe answer would do. "Because no one else did," she said, "and because you were counting." He did not flinch. He did not ask how she knew. He only let the smallest movement happen at the corner of his mouth, a thing that was not quite a smile and was certainly not nothing. "You noticed. You were tapping, on your knee, in threes. Habit. A patient habit. A long one." Somewhere behind the doors a woman laughed, high and sharp and uninterested in anything that could not be eaten or worn, and the laugh broke whatever small thing had been forming between them on the cold floor. Yelena gathered the empty cup. She tucked it back under her shawl. She stood. "There is a door," she said quietly, "at the end of the east passage. It opens on a courtyard. The courtyard has a bench. The bench is out of the wind. If you are still here in an hour, I can walk you to it. There is a stove in the gatehouse. The gatekeeper owes me a kindness. And if I am not still here in an hour, then you will have gone somewhere warmer, and I will be glad of it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he inclined his head, the smallest fraction of a bow, the kind of bow a man gives when he has not yet decided whether to give the larger one, and she went back down the corridor, with the empty cup against her ribs, and her count climbing quietly in her chest. 100 had stepped over him. 1 had knelt. She did not yet know what that arithmetic would cost her. She only knew, with the certainty of a girl who had learned to trust the small things, that the arithmetic had begun. In the ballroom, the chandeliers were doing what chandeliers do at parties of that kind, which is to say, they were performing an idea of light rather than light itself. candles by the 100, glass by the 1,000, and beneath them a sea of shoulders and silks, and the slow, circular motion of people who were less interested in dancing than in being seen to know how. The music was a waltz, played by a small orchestra arranged at the far end on a raised dais, and the waltz was being conducted with the careful timidity of musicians who had been told twice that the lady of the house preferred her tempo unhurried. The lady of the house was the Countess Verena Tolzin, and she preferred a great many things unhurried. She preferred her wine warmed slightly. She preferred her compliments delivered in pairs. She preferred her servants to keep their faces empty of weather, and her guests to keep their conversation empty of consequence. She had inherited the estate 11 years earlier, upon the death of an uncle whose taste she had never shared, and she had spent the 11 years in question replacing his furniture and his staff in roughly equal measure. The ballroom, which under her uncle had been a long, light-filled room hung with hunting scenes, was now a long, light-filled room hung with mirrors, so that the guests might see themselves twice, and the room might seem larger than it was. The Countess found this arrangement very satisfactory. Tonight she was hosting what the cards had called a winter reception, which meant in practice that she was conducting an inventory. She had invited every family within a day's ride whose name still carried weight, and a number of families whose names were beginning to slip. And she had arranged the seating at supper according to a chart she had revised 4 times in the past week. The chart was a kind of map of the future, as she imagined it. She was a woman who believed firmly that the future was something that could be drawn, if one had the right pen. She had not drawn the old man on the floor by the column. The old man on the floor by the column was, in fact, a small embarrassment that her steward had brought to her attention an hour before the first carriage arrived. He had been found, the steward said, at the side gate, asking for a Master Aldrin who had not lived at the estate for 40 years. He had given no other name. He had been, the steward said carefully, insistent. The Countess had considered the matter for the time it took to adjust an earring, and had pronounced her judgment. He was not to be turned out, because turning out an elderly man in this weather would be a story, and stories were a thing the Countess found tiring. He was, however, to be kept inside the small vestibule by the east column, out of sight of the principal stair, and given nothing but water until the morning, when the matter could be handled with daylight and without witnesses. The steward had bowed. The steward had also, being a man who had served the Countess for 9 years, and her uncle for 16 before that, taken the small further liberty of placing a folded blanket beneath the old man's elbow, which the Countess did not know about, and which the old man had quietly refused. So the old man had been there since before the candles were lit. He had watched the florists arrive with their armfuls of hothouse roses. He had watched the underfootman carry in the silver. He had watched the first carriage pull up to the principal stair, and disgorge a woman in pale green silk who had stepped into the hall, taken one look at him, and addressed her remark to the air above his head. Verena really must do something about the draughts, she had said, and had walked on. He had counted them, as Yelena had guessed. He had counted them not out of bitterness, which he had outlived, and not out of curiosity, which he had nearly outlived, but out of a long, patient habit of taking the measure of a room before he spoke in it. He had been taking the measure of rooms for 61 years. He was very good at it. By the time Yelena had knelt beside him with the bread, he had completed his measurements, and he had reached a conclusion. The conclusion did not please him exactly. It had never been a conclusion that pleased him, in any of the rooms in which he had reached it. But it clarified him. It set the small machinery behind his eyes into the alignment he reserved for nights on which a decision would have to be made before dawn. He had not expected the girl. He had, in fact, made a small private wager with himself, somewhere around the 70th guest, that no one would stop. He had won wagers of that kind before. He had a long, dry catalogue of them. He had been prepared, when the count reached 100 and the wager closed, to feel the small, wry satisfaction of a man whose worst suspicions had been confirmed, and to proceed from that confirmation to the cold, useful business of the morning. The girl had cost him the wager. The girl had cost him, in fact, several other things he had not been prepared to spend tonight. The clean edge of his conclusion, for instance, the simplicity of the morning he had planned, the pleasure he had been intending to take in a certain quiet, precise act of correction at first light, which he now found himself wishing to soften, not because the correction was less deserved, but because a correction delivered in the same room as such a kindness would be a kind of vulgarity, and he had spent his life avoiding vulgarity in matters of consequence. He shifted, very slightly, against the column. The marble was as cold as it had been an hour earlier. He had stopped feeling that cold somewhere around the 40th guest, which was not, he knew, a sign of comfort. He folded his hands more carefully in his lap. He breathed evenly. He thought about the girl's face, which had been a serious face, neither pretty in the way the room would have called pretty, nor plain in any way that mattered, and which had had at its center a pair of attentive brown eyes that had taken in his tapping fingers and read them correctly. Patient habit. A long one. He thought, too, about the small, considered way she had lied to the head footman in the corridor. He had heard the exchange. The corridor carried sound, and he had been trained long ago to listen to corridors. She had not lied badly. She had lied with the economy of a person who lied rarely, and therefore, when required, lied well. He approved of this. He had always preferred competence to virtue, when forced to choose, on the grounds that competence was rarer and more useful, and that virtue without competence was merely sentiment. He sat. He waited. He listened to the waltz, which was very nearly a good waltz, and would have been a good waltz under a different conductor. And he allowed himself, for the first time in many hours, the small luxury of imagining a particular face when it was told a particular piece of news. It was not a charitable luxury. He set it down again almost at once. He had not come here for that kind of pleasure. He had come here for an accounting, which was a different thing entirely, and which would be conducted, as all his accountings were, in a low voice, and with very little furniture moved. Down the corridor, in the warm yellow square of the kitchens, Yelena was carrying a tray of pastries shaped like crowns toward the ballroom doors, and she was thinking, against her will, about the way the old man had said her surname, Marisova. He had said it the way one says a word that has occurred to one before. He had said it the way her grandfather had once said the names of horses he had known many years earlier, with recognition, and with a small, private regret, and without surprise. She did not know what to do with that. She set the thought down beside the others she had collected that evening. The precision of his fingers, the gray of his eyes, the patient threes of his tapping, the bow that had been half a bow and might, in a different room, have been the whole one. And she carried the pastries through the doors into the ballroom, where the chandeliers performed their idea of light, and the Countess performed her idea of the future, and 100 guests performed, with great elegance, an idea of themselves. She did not look toward the column. She had decided, somewhere between the kitchen and the doors, that not looking would be the better discipline. The head footman was watching her again from the dais by the orchestra. She felt his look, the way one feels a draft, and she walked through it without giving it the satisfaction of a shiver. At the long table by the windows, the Countess Verena Tolzin was holding a small glass of something pale and sweet, and she was speaking to a gentleman in a dark blue coat. The gentleman in the dark blue coat was a Baron Estven, who had recently lost a great deal of money in a venture involving timber, and had been invited, the Countess felt, more out of charity than out of expectation. He was nodding at whatever the Countess was saying with the careful frequency of a man whose attention was elsewhere. His elsewhere was the door. He had been watching the door since he arrived. He had been watching it not because he expected anyone in particular, but because he had been told, by a person whose information he had learned over many years to trust, that someone in particular might appear there tonight, and that if that someone appeared, he was to do nothing at all, and to say nothing at all, and most especially to refrain from any expression of recognition. He had been instructed, in fact, to behave as if he had never in his life heard the name he had heard most often in his career. So far, the door had produced only the expected, families and silks, and the low, continuous arrival of people who had been invited. Baron Estven nodded at the Countess. He sipped his pale, sweet drink. He watched the door. He did not, because he had been told not to, glance toward the column by the east wall, where an old man in a coat the color of wet ash sat with his hands folded in his lap and his breathing very even. The Countess, who noticed most things and misread many of them, noticed the Baron's attention to the door and concluded with satisfaction that he was waiting for a particular young woman she had seated him beside at supper. She made a small, private note to revise the chart again before the meal. She believed, as she always believed, that she was drawing the future with the right pen. In the corridor, the head footman had finished his slow consideration of the kitchen girl, and had reached his own conclusion, which was that Yelena Marasova was a problem that would shortly need to be solved. He had reached this conclusion several times before, over the 8 months of her employment, and had each time set it aside because she worked harder than the other girls, and broke fewer glasses, and had the kind of face that the Countess preferred not to see crying. Tonight, however, he had seen her on the floor, where she ought not to have been, and he had heard her lie about a glass that had not existed, and he had felt, behind both observations, the small, unmistakable click of a girl who was beginning to act on principles of her own. Principles, in his experience, were the most expensive thing a servant could acquire. He resolved to speak to the steward in the morning. He did not yet know that the morning would not belong to him. Yelena set the tray of crown-shaped pastries on the long table at the windows, and stepped back into the wall the way she had been taught to step back into walls, which was to make of herself a vertical line, and to keep her hands at her sides, and to let the room flow around her as if she were a column herself. From this position, she could see almost the whole of the ballroom without appearing to see any of it. She could see the Countess at the far end, and the Baron in the dark blue coat, and the door by which guests still occasionally arrived, and the long rectangle of the corridor that led, eventually, past the kitchens and the back stair, and the east column, where an old man was, by her count, into his 6th hour of stillness. She could not see him from the wall. She did not need to. She knew, without looking, that he was where she had left him, and that he was waiting, and that the waiting was not the waiting of a man who had given up, but the waiting of a man who had not yet begun. She knew this in the way she knew the weather, by a pressure she could feel along her arms. A voice spoke very close to her ear. "You are new." She did not turn her head. She had been taught not to turn her head when addressed at a wall. She lowered her chin a small, deferential degree. 8 months, my lord. 8 months. And do you find it agreeable? I find it employment, my lord. A small huff of laughter that was almost not laughter. She risked a sidelong glance and met, with a brief shock she did not allow to reach her face, the eyes of Baron Estvin, who had crossed the room with the slow, distracted gait of a man on his way to nothing in particular, and who was now standing beside her, with his glass tilted at a polite, conversational angle. Employment, he repeated. A very precise word. I try, my lord, to use precise words. That is a habit, he said, I have known in one other person in my life. He used to tell me that imprecise words were the chief cause of imprecise actions, and that imprecise actions were the chief cause of most of the world's grief. He was a man, you understand, who took grief very seriously. She kept her chin lowered. She kept her hands at her sides. She felt at the back of her neck the careful weight of being told something that was not what it appeared to be. He sounds, my lord, like a man worth listening to. He was. He is. Is, my lord. Is. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked instead at the long corridor that led past the kitchens and the back stair and the east column, and he held his glass at the same polite, conversational angle, and after a small, carefully chosen moment, he inclined the glass 1/8 of an inch in that direction, the way a man might gesture toward a portrait he wished his companion to consider. And then he straightened the glass again and turned, and smiled at the Countess across the room, and walked back to her table at a pace exactly as unconcerned as the pace at which he had walked away. Yelena did not move. She counted his footsteps as he went, because counting steadied her. She counted to 12 before he reached the table. She counted the breaths she took before her own pulse settled. She counted to 7. She thought about the way he had said "is" twice, the second time more quietly than the first, the way one underlines a word with a fingernail rather than a pen. She thought about the old man's surname, which she did not know. She thought about her own, Marisova. He had said it the way her grandfather had said the names of horses, with recognition, with a small private regret, without surprise. Her grandfather had been a steward once, on an estate far to the north. He had told her, when she was small and he was already old, that the family they served had been a family that no longer existed, that the great house had been taken apart stone by stone after a winter she had not been alive to see, and that the master of that house had vanished into a long road from which, her grandfather said, certain men do not return, and certain other men return only when they choose. He had said this with a small, particular pride of a servant who had loved his master without ever quite saying so, and he had then changed the subject, as he always did, to the weather and to the price of oats, which he treated with equal gravity. Her grandfather had been dead 4 years. She had not thought of his master, whom he had never named, in any of those 4 years. She thought of him now. The chandeliers performed their idea of light. The orchestra performed its idea of a waltz. The Countess performed her idea of the future. And down the long lacquered corridor, behind the small embarrassment of a side vestibule, an old man with eyes the color of a struck bell folded his hands more carefully in his lap and waited for the hour in which the room would belong, at last, to him. It came, as such hours come, without announcement. The orchestra finished a piece. The Countess raised one elegant hand. The steward stepped forward and rang, very softly, the small silver bell that meant the guests were to move toward the supper room. They moved, as guests of that kind move, in a long, shimmering procession of silks and shoulders and slow, circular pleasantries, and the corridor by the east column emptied of attendants, because all of the attendants were required in the supper room, and the corridor became, for a brief, unguarded interval, only a corridor. Yelena was sent ahead with a tray of small glasses. She walked the corridor with her eyes forward and her count climbing. She passed the column. She did not turn her head. The old man was no longer there. She felt the absence before she registered it. The corridor felt different, the way a room feels different when a fire has gone out. She did not stop. She did not look back. She carried the tray of small glasses into the supper room and set it on the sideboard, and stepped back into the wall, and she let her count steady her. One tray delivered, one absence noted, 1 hour perhaps, until the room would know what she already, in some part of her, had begun to suspect. In the supper room, the Countess took her place at the head of the long table. The chart she had revised 4 times was, in her mind, a perfect map of the evening. She had only to follow it. She looked down the length of the table at her guests and felt, briefly and pleasantly, the small, godlike satisfaction of a woman whose future was drawn in the right pen. The steward stepped forward to make the small announcement that preceded the soup. He cleared his throat. He had a good voice for announcements, low and even, and he had been making them in this house for 25 years. He drew breath. A second voice spoke first. It came from the doorway at the far end of the supper room, the small doorway by which the household entered when the household was not meant to be seen. It was a quiet voice. It did not need to be loud. It carried the way certain voices carry without effort, because the room had been built, long ago and by a different owner, to carry a voice from precisely that door to precisely the head of the table. "Forgive me," the voice said. "I believe there has been an error in the seating." Every head turned. The man in the doorway was not, at first glance, the man Yelena had fed bread to in the corridor. The coat, the color of wet ash, was gone. In its place was a long, dark coat of a cut she had never seen at this estate, severe and exact, with a single narrow band of silver at the cuff that meant, to anyone who had been taught to read such things, a great deal more than silver. His hair had been smoothed back, his hands folded now in front of him rather than in his lap, were the hands she remembered, precise, patient, accustomed to being obeyed. His eyes were the grey of a struck bell. The Countess had risen halfway from her chair before she knew she had risen. She was a woman who noticed most things and misread many of them. And she was, in the small, frozen instant before recognition arrived, misreading this one too. She had begun to assemble a polite welcome for a late and distinguished guest, whose carriage she must have somehow failed to hear. The welcome reached her lips. It died there. Recognition arrived. It arrived in the way the worst recognitions arrive, which is all at once and from several directions. From the shape of the man's jaw, which she had seen in a portrait in the long gallery of her childhood. From the cut of the coat, which she had been taught to identify before she had been taught to read. From the small, grave inclination of his head, which was the inclination of a man who was about to be very courteous about something, for which courtesy was the cruelest possible instrument. She sat down. She did not mean to. Her legs had been consulted by a part of her older than her vanity, and they had voted. "Your Grace," said Baron Estevan, from his place halfway down the table, and he rose and bowed, and the bow was the entire bow, given in full, given without hesitation, the bow of a man who had been waiting a very long time to give it, and was glad of the chance at last. The word traveled the table the way a struck bell travels a valley. Your Grace, Your Grace, Your Grace. The guests rose as the word reached them, in a slow, uneven ripple, silks rustling, chairs scraping softly, the small, godlike map of the evening tearing very quietly down its center seam. The Grand Duke, Mikhail Aldrin Vsevorov, who had been counted over by 100 guests on a cold marble floor and fed bread by a kitchen girl who counted everything, walked the length of the supper room with the unhurried pace of a man who had already done the difficult part of the evening hours ago. He stopped beside the chair at the head of the table. He did not sit. He turned very slightly toward the small doorway from which he had entered, and he spoke once more in the quiet voice that the room had been built to carry. "Elena Marasova," he said, "please come in." She came. She did not know until she was walking that she was walking. She set down the tray of small glasses on the sideboard with the careful unhurriedness of a girl whose hurry would be punished, and she crossed the polished floor under the eyes of 100 guests, and she stopped a careful 3 paces from him because 3 was the number she had been taught, and because 3 was the number he had tapped on his knee. He inclined his head to her. It was the whole bow this time. It was given in full. "Your grandfather," he said, "served my father. He served him very well. He wrote to me, before he died, about a granddaughter who counted things and who had, he said, a steady hand. I have been a long time arriving. Forgive me." She did not answer. She could not, just then, find the precise word. He turned to the room. "There has been an error in the seating," he said again, very gently. "It will be corrected. There will be no further errors tonight." He looked once at the Countess Verena Tolzin. He did not speak to her. He did not need to. The look was not cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was an accounting, low-voiced, and with very little furniture moved. And the Countess, who had spent 11 years drawing the future with the right pen, understood in that single look that the pen had never been hers. He offered Yelena his arm. She took it. Her hand on the dark sleeve was steady, because she had decided, somewhere between the sideboard and the head of the table, that it would be. The silver band at his cuff was cool under her fingertips, narrower than she had expected, the kind of detail one would miss if one were not in the habit of noticing detail. She noticed it. She filed it away. He drew out the chair to the right of his own and seated her there. He sat. He looked down the long table at the room he had measured an hour before, and he smiled, very slightly, the smile of a man who had spent a long evening on a cold floor, and had decided, on balance, that the cold had been worth what it had bought. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the first pale edge of dawn was beginning to push at the dark. The soup was served. The orchestra in the next room began, uncertainly, a piece more suited to mornings than to nights. The guests ate, because they had been taught, very young, to keep eating no matter what the table did. The Countess Verena Tolzin lifted her spoon and set it down again twice before she trusted her hand to lift it a third time. And the Baron in the dark blue coat caught Yelena's eye, once, across the long table, and inclined his glass 1/8 of an inch in her direction, the way a man might gesture toward a portrait he wished her, at last, to see. She inclined her head in return. She did not smile. She had not yet decided what her face was for in this new room. She thought, instead, of her grandfather, who had spoken of horses he had known many years earlier with recognition and a small private regret, and without surprise. She thought of the bread, which had been warm when she tore it. She thought of the bell-grey eyes that had read her on the cold floor, and had not, even then, given anything away. She lifted her spoon, and somewhere in her, the Count that had been climbing all evening came, very quietly, to rest. The morning, when it fully arrived, did what mornings do in such houses. It found the candles guttered, and the chandeliers dimmed to their honest selves, and the long mirrors showing, for once, only what was in front of them. The Grand Duke did not raise his voice in any of the hours that followed. He did not need to. He spoke quietly to the steward, who bowed more deeply than he had bowed in 25 years, and went out at once to make certain small adjustments to certain small ledgers that had, for several years, been kept in the wrong hand. He spoke quietly to Baron Estevan, who listened with the attentive stillness of a man receiving instructions he had been waiting half his career to receive. He spoke, briefly and without unkindness, to the Countess Verena Tolzin, whose face during their conversation went through several careful colors before settling on the pale one she would wear, with diminishing success, for the rest of her life. And in the late, soft light of mid-morning, when the last of the carriages had departed, and the great hall was, for the first time in many hours, properly quiet, he walked the long lacquered corridor with Yelena beside him, and he stopped, deliberately, by the east column where he had sat the night before. He looked at the marble. He looked at the place on the floor where she had knelt. 100, he said. 100, she agreed. And one. And one. He nodded once, the small, private nod of a man closing a ledger that had taken 61 years to close. Then he offered her his arm again, and they walked on, past the column, past the corridor, past the kitchens where the head footman stood very still against the wall, and did not, for once in his life, watch her go by. Outside, the courtyard was full of pale winter sun. The bench was out of the wind. The gatehouse stove was lit, and the gatekeeper, who owed her a kindness, was standing in his door with his cap in his hands and an expression of grave, dawning understanding on his face. She did not sit on the bench. She had no need to now. She stood beside the Grand Duke in the pale winter sun, and she felt, for the first time that she could remember, the small, unfamiliar sensation of being precisely where the Count had brought her. The fire is low, friend, and the cup is nearly empty, and the story I had to tell you tonight is told. I wanted to set it down by the hearth between us before the embers gave out, because some stories are better shared than kept, and this one has wanted telling for a long time. If you have ever been the one who knelt when no one else did, if you have ever carried a steady hand through a room that did not see you, if you have ever been counted over and gone on counting yourself anyway, quietly, in threes, the way patient people do, then this story was, in some quiet way, about you, and I am glad you sat with it. Tell me, when you have a moment, which line stayed with you? Was it the bread, still warm when she tore it? The eyes, the color of a struck bell? The small inclination of a glass, 1/8 of an inch toward a corridor? Or the Count that climbed all evening and came at last, quietly, to rest? I would like to know which moment found you by your own fire tonight. And if you would like to come back another evening, when the kettle is on again and the chairs are pulled close, there is always another story waiting to be told here by the hearth. Another quiet room, another overlooked life, another small kindness that turns out, by dawn, to have been the whole of the matter. Pull up your chair when you can. Stay as long as you like. Sleep gently, friend. The fire will be lit again when you return.